Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are looking at a man who stood in the crossfire of the 19th century culture wars, John Chambers. He was called a heretic by his own church for refusing to sign a creed, yet he built one of the largest congregations in Philadelphia. We're exploring a life spent battling infidels in the newspapers, fighting the rise of skepticism, and defining exactly what it means to believe in God when the religious establishment shuts the door in your face. It's a story of whiskey, theater, chains across the street, and a fierce independent faith.
It is a massive story, and a complicated one. We're diving into the life of a man who was essentially a theological bare-knuckle boxer.
A bare-knuckle boxer, I like that.
Yeah, he really didn't fit into the polite, drawing room society of the 19th century, and he certainly didn't fit into the established church structures, not at all.
Usually when we look back at religious figures from the 1800s, there's this image of stiff collars, very polite, very dusty sermons.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you describe that introduction fighting infidels in the newspaper, that sounds surprisingly modern. It sounds like a Twitter war, but with, ink and paper.
It was absolutely a brawl. And the fascinating thing about John Chambers is that he wasn't fighting these battles from the safety of an ivory tower or a seminary classroom.
Right.
He was fighting them on the street level. Literally on the street. And the source we're looking at today really captures that. It's a biography titled John Chambers, Servant of Christ and Master of Hearts by William Elliott Griffiths.
Okay.
And the mission for this deep dive is to really understand that tension. The tension between rigid institutional theology and a practical boots-on-the-ground faith.
And specifically, we want to look at how he handled the God question, right? Because looking at the outline, this wasn't just a fight between different Christian factions. He was fighting the very concept of atheism.
Precisely. That's the core of it. We are going to look at how a religious leader in the 1830s and 40s engaged with these rising tides of atheism, universalism, and just general secular thought.
It's easy to forget that was even a thing back then.
Oh, absolutely. We have this idea that everyone was devout, but the culture wars regarding faith and skepticism were alive and kicking in 1825. There was a genuine intellectual battle over whether God existed and, crucially, what that meant for society.
So let's get into the man himself. Who was John Chambers? Was he, born into this specific type of conflict, or did he choose it?
That's the nature versus nurture question, isn't it? I think in many ways his environment engineered him for conflict. He was born in Ireland in Stewartstown in 1797. But the crucial part of his formation happens when his family migrates to the American frontier when he was just a child.
We're not talking about like Philadelphia in 1790. We're talking about the real frontier.
We are talking about the Ohio frontier. Log cabins, wilderness, isolation, complete isolation. The biography paints this really vivid picture of his existence. It was a life of silence, of hard labor, of just survival.
That's got to shape you.
How could it not? But there is also the factor of his heritage. Griffiths, the biographer, he spends some time discussing the Irish temperament, or more accurately, the Scotch-Irish nature.
Okay, I feel like that can be a bit of a stereotype, but in the context of the 19th century, what did that actually mean to them? What were they trying to get at with that label?
Well, in this context, it referred to a very specific combination of high emotion, a fighting spirit, and a real love for controversy, a love for a good argument.
I see.
There was an old saying that the Irish were known for two things, religion and whiskey. It implies a kind of volatility, a passion that can go either toward the divine or, toward the destructive.
And Chambers seems to have taken all of that energy and just channeled it entirely in one direction.
He did, and that's the irony of his life. While he embodied that fighting Irish spirit in his religion, he became a fierce, lifelong enemy of the whiskey. A sworn enemy.
So he saw that destructive side of the temperament and decided to crush it.
Completely. But growing up in Ohio shaped his mind in this very specific way. There's a story from his childhood. The biographer calls it the Buckeye story, and I think it explains his entire theology better than any seminary textbook ever could.
Right, I read this in the notes. This is the part where he thinks he finds the word Ohio in the Bible.
Well, close. Yeah, pretty much. So you have to imagine this boy. He's in a log cabin. There are no libraries, no newspapers, certainly no internet. The only book in the entire house is the Bible.
So that's his whole world.
It's his entire universe of information. He reads it voraciously because it's the only source of intellectual stimulation he has. Now, Ohio is known as the Buckeye State, which is named after the horse chestnuts found there.
Right.
So young John Chambers is combing through the genealogies in First Chronicles, which, let's be honest, is usually the boring part where most people's eyes just glaze over.
The begats, yeah.
Exactly, the begats. And he's reading through them, and he finds the name Buki. It's Buki, the son of Abishua and the father of Uzi.
And he makes the connection in his head. Bucky.
Buckeye.
He was absolutely delighted. He ran to his parents, convinced he had found the Buckeyes in the Bible. He thought he had found his home, his specific reality, written right there in the holy text.
That's actually very revealing.
It is. On the surface, it's just a cute story about a naive kid. But if you look deeper, it establishes a pattern for his whole life.
It shows he was looking for a direct connection, doesn't it? He wasn't waiting for a priest or a pastor to tell him what the book meant. He was going right to the source.
Exactly. He wanted to find his world, his reality, directly in those pages, without anyone else interpreting it for him.
Mm-hmm.
This is the seed of what we call biblical literalism or primitivism, the idea that the text creates the world and you don't need a filter.
No middleman.
No middleman. And this mindset travels with him when he leaves the log cabin and eventually heads to Baltimore for his formal education.
Okay, and this education phase is where the heretic label really starts to brew. He studies under a man named John Mason Duncan. Who was he? What was his deal? John Mason Duncan is the intellectual father of Chambers' rebellion. I mean, if you want to understand why Chambers spent his entire life as an outsider, you have to understand Duncan. Duncan was a radical for his time, a complete radical.
In what way?
He taught his students to be deeply suspicious of creeds and confessions of faith.
Oh, okay, let's slow down and unpack this, because for a modern listener, creeds just sounds like what we believe. Sounds harmless. When you say he was suspicious of creeds, are we talking about things like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed?
We are talking specifically about the Westminster Confession of Faith. For the Presbyterian Church, and for many other Calvinist traditions, the confession was this incredibly detailed legal and theological document that explained exactly what the Bible meant.
Ah, so it's like the user manual. You have the Bible, which is the product, and the confession is the official manual telling you how to operate it.
That's a perfect analogy. And Duncan's argument, which Chambers adopted with zero hesitation, was that the manual was replacing the product.
I see.
He believed that the Bible is addressed to the people, directly. Not to scholars, not to councils, but to the individual. They believed that if you place a man-made creed above the Bible, or even put it alongside the Bible as a requirement for a minister, you are basically insulting God.
You're saying God's word isn't clear enough on its own.
You're saying it needs help. It needs a human filter. And for them, that was blasphemy.
That sounds very American, honestly. That deep-seated individualism, don't tread on me, applied to theology.
It is incredibly American, and it fits perfectly with that frontier log cabin upbringing. But you have to see it from the other side. The Presbyterian establishment viewed this as dangerous anarchy.
Right. Because if everyone just interprets the Bible for themselves, how do you maintain order? How do you stop heresy from cropping up everywhere?
How do you maintain the institution? That's the real question. And so this all comes to a head in 1825. Chambers is ready to become a pastor. He goes to what is essentially his final job interview.
Meeting in the Presbytery in Newtown.
Yes. And you can just imagine the scene. The room is full of these somber, educated, very serious clergymen. And in walks this fiery young man from the frontier. They ask him the standard questions about his faith, his calling, and eventually they get to the big one. They ask him if he subscribes to the Confession of Faith.
This is the moment of truth. And the easy answer is just to say yes, right? Even if he has his doubts, just sign the paper and get the job.
That's what 99% of people would do. Just nod, sign it, and then go preach whatever you want in your own pulpit later. But that wasn't Chambers. He says no.
He refuses point blank, in front of everyone.
Point blank. He tells them he believes the Bible is the only infallible rule of faith and practice. He refuses to sign off on a man-made document as an equal authority.
And the result must have been explosive.
Rejection, immediate and total. He was branded a heretic. The source material has this really poignant line, "The orthodoxy of yesterday is turned out."
That's a great line.
It's perfect. And we need to be crystal clear here. He wasn't rejected because he was an atheist or because he denied the divinity of Christ or because he stole money.
No.
He was rejected because he wanted to be too biblical. He was rejected for relying on the Bible to the exclusion of church authority.
That must have been such a profound shock. He thinks he's being the ultimate faithful servant, the most pure adherent to the text, And the institution itself tells him he's unwanted.
It forced him into the wilderness, theologically speaking. He couldn't be a Presbyterian pastor. So he became an independent. He had to find his own way. He found a congregation in Philadelphia that was willing to take a chance on this so-called heretic, and he became a sort of freelance soldier for God.
And that rejection is crucial, isn't it? It gave him a chip on his shoulder.
It did. And it meant that for the rest of his life, he didn't answer to a bishop or a synod or a council. He answered only to God and his own conscience.
Which makes him dangerous.
Extremely dangerous to the status quo.
So he lands in Philadelphia at this independent church. And the origin story of this specific building is pretty wild, too. It's called the Church of the Vow.
It sounds like something out of a legend, doesn't it? The church was built by a woman named Margaret Duncan. Years before Chambers ever got there, she was on a ship coming to America, and they hit a massive storm. The ship was breaking apart. It was sinking.
Terrifying.
In that moment of terror, facing death in the freezing Atlantic, she made a vow to God. She promised that if he saved her, she would use her money to build a church in her new home.
And she survived.
She survived, she prospered in Philadelphia, and she kept her vow. She built the church. But by the time John Chambers arrived, the church was struggling. It needed a leader as bold as its origin story. And Chambers was that guy.
This is where we get to one of the most striking images in the entire outline. The chains across the street. When I first read this, I honestly thought it was a metaphor.
No.
But they literally put iron chains across a public road.
Literally. And this is where we have to look at the why. It wasn't just about noise, though that was part of it. You have to visualize Philadelphia in the 1830s. The streets are paved with cobblestones. Carriages have iron-rimmed wheels.
So it's loud.
It's deafening. It's the constant roar of commerce, the sound of the city moving. And Chambers decided his service deserved silence.
Okay, so it's loud. But blocking a public street, how did he even get away with that?
And he and his trustees, they petitioned the city. They asked for the right to stretch iron chains across the street during worship hours to stop the traffic.
But the city just let them.
Eventually, yes, but it sparked a massive legal battle first. And this is the part that is often overlooked. This wasn't just some quirky local custom. This was a private religious institution seizing control of public infrastructure.
It's a huge deal.
It's a massive deal. Chambers was effectively claiming that God's law, the need for silence and reverence, superseded the municipal right-of-way. It asks a huge question. Does religious freedom include the right to silence the world around you?
That is such a power move. He's telling the merchants, the travelers, the non-believers, everyone, you stop moving when we are talking to God.
Exactly. It was an aggressive assertion of the holy over the secular. And somehow, Chambers had the political clout, or at least the sheer stubbornness, to enforce it. For decades, if you were trying to get down that street on a Sunday morning, you hit a chain. The world had to stop for the church.
It really highlights how different the mindset was. Today, churches try so hard to be welcoming, accessible, come as you are.
Yeah.
They have coffee bars and rock bands.
Right.
Putting up a chain is the exact opposite of that. It's saying, we are separate, we are different, and you will respect our space.
It defines his entire ministry, separation. He wasn't trying to blend in with the culture. He was trying to build a wall against it. And this brings us to the theater controversy, which is another perfect example of this obsession with purity and separation.
Right, the story of the elder who went to the theater.
So Chambers finds out that one of his elders, and an elder is a high-ranking, respected lay leader in the church, had attended a play.
Which, to a modern listener, seems trivial. Completely harmless, who cares?
To us, yes. But in that era, for strict moralists like Chambers, the theater was viewed as the vestibule of hell.
The vestibule of hell.
Wow. It was associated with loose morals, often with prostitution in the surrounding areas, and with a general spirit of falseness and vanity. It was the epitome of worldly amusement.
So Chambers confronts him.
He doesn't just confront him. He goes to the entire board of elders and gives them an ultimatum. He says, either he resigns or I resign.
He was willing to quit his entire livelihood to walk away from his church over one guy seeing a play.
He absolutely was, and he quoted scripture to back it up. Come out from among them and be ye separate. For Chambers, you couldn't straddle the fence. You were either entirely for God, which meant rejecting the world's amusements, or you were an enemy. There was no middle ground. There was no gray area.
That absolute certainty is. It's intense.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the kind of armor you need if you're going to fight the real battle of his life. And this is where we need to shift focus to the core of this deep dive. The battle wasn't just about theater or street chains. It was about the existence of God itself.
Yes. This is the God versus the world section. And we tend to think of the 19th century as this universally religious time, but that is a complete myth. Griffiths, the biographer, paints a picture of a rising tide of fierce intellectual skepticism right there in Philadelphia.
And the outline mentions this group called the Sunday Institute. Who were they?
The Sunday Institute was a gathering of people who called themselves freethinkers. The religious people called them infidels or atheists. They met on Sundays in a hall on 6th Street, and their primary activity was discussing and often mocking Christianity.
So while Chambers is preaching on one street, they're literally down the road deconstructing his arguments. It's like a direct counter-programming.
It was exactly that. And they weren't just, throwing insults from a barstool. They were reading Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. They were reading Voltaire. They were using logic and what we would now call textual criticism to try and tear apart the Bible.
I see. So this is an organized intellectual opposition.
Very much so. The source mentions a skeptic from this group who cornered the biographer, Griffiths, when Griffiths was just a boy. And this man tried to prove the Bible was a fraud by pointing out what he called discrepancies.
What kind of discrepancies are we talking about?
Well, the example given is the mention of the word artillery in the King James translation of 1 Samuel. The skeptic would ask the boy, how could there be artillery in ancient Israel? This book is a fraud. It's full of anachronisms.
That's a classic gotcha question, isn't it? It's looking for one technical error to invalidate the entire work.
It is a very common tactic. And Chambers' response to this was not to retreat behind his church walls and his chains. He engaged head on, and he did something very innovative for the time. He used the media.
How so?
He started advertising his sermon topics in the Public Ledger, a popular newspaper.
That was new. Advertising your sermon like it was a commercial product.
Oh, it was very new. And look at the titles he chose. They weren't gentle. He would announce sermons on topics like infidels, or the malignant deception of infidels against Christianity, or simply annihilation.
See, it was pure sensationalism. He was deliberately using the language of the tabloids to get people into the pews.
He wasn't above using shock value to get a hearing. He wanted those skeptics to come. He wanted them in his building. He would call out Thomas Paine and Voltaire by name from the pulpit.
He'd name them.
By name, and he would look up into the gallery and he would spot the skeptics who were there taking notes. The source describes a Voltairean-looking old gentleman, and he would point and address them directly from the pulpit.
That's incredible. So this is what I really want to dig into. When he is standing there, facing down these atheists and freethinkers, what is his actual argument? Is he trying to out-logic them? Is he debating textual criticism?
No, and that's the absolute key to understanding him. He did not use high-level philosophy. He didn't try to debate the scientific nuances of the word artillery in 1 Samuel. He used a moral and a sociological argument.
Okay.
His core argument, which comes out most clearly in a famous sermon titled, "Ye Shall Not Surely Die," was all about the consequences of belief.
Ye shall not surely die. That's what the serpent said to Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Exactly. Chambers brilliantly framed all of modern skepticism, both atheism and universalism, which is the belief that all are saved and there is no hell. He framed it all as the serpent's original lie.
I see the move he's making.
And his argument was intensely pragmatic. He basically said, if you remove the fear of God, and specifically the fear of judgment and hell, you remove the only effective restraint on human wickedness.
So his argument isn't, my theology is more logically consistent. His argument is, if you guys win, society collapses.
Yes. That's it in a nutshell. He believed that without the terror of the Lord, as the Bible calls it, there was no ultimate reason for a man to be honest or faithful to his wife or peaceful with his neighbor. He argued that atheism leads inevitably to anarchy.
He's not really arguing about what's true in a cosmic sense. He's arguing about what works to hold a city together.
He was telling his listeners and those skeptics in the balcony, look at your philosophy. It offers no ultimate justice. It offers no check on power. It destroys the civil order. My philosophy, whether you like it or not, keeps society from falling apart.
That is a very powerful argument to a 19th century audience that was terrified of disorder and social upheaval. He's essentially saying, you might have a point about the translation of a single word, but I have a system that keeps us from murdering each other in the streets.
It's the moral utility argument. And he combined it with a fierce, unwavering defense of the literal Bible. For Chambers, if you give up 1 inch, if you admit the Garden of Eden is a metaphor, or that Noah's flood is an allegory, or that hell isn't a real place of fire, the whole structure falls apart. He was fighting for the literal, terrifying, and, for believers, comforting reality of the text.
There's another sermon mentioned in the outline called the Gashmu sermon. That sounds very obscure.
It is, but it's a brilliant bit of rhetorical strategy. It's based on a tiny verse in Nehemiah, chapter 6, verse 6. The line is, "It is reported among the heathen, and Gashmu saith it."
Who on earth is Gashmu?
He's nobody. That's the whole point. He's just a name attached to a rumor. He's a gossip. And Chambers preached a whole sermon on this, which he titled, "The Immortality of the Scandalmonger."
Love that.
He talked about how enemies of God, and not so subtly enemies of John Chambers, invent lies and spread rumors just to become famous. They want to attach their names to something great, even if it's by attacking it.
That is incredibly savvy. It's a preemptive strike. He's telling his people, don't listen to the critics. They're just Gashmus. They're just first-century clout chasers.
Precisely. And his advice was simple. If a dog barks at you, don't bark back. He refused to get into the mud and debate the specific rumors, but he attacked the character and the motive of the rumor mongers. It was a way of inoculating his congregation against the skepticism outside the church walls. He wasn't just teaching them what to believe, he was teaching them how to dismiss the critics.
So we have this picture of a warrior, a real fighter. He's fighting atheists in the newspapers, he's fighting the theater, he's fighting the whiskey distillers. And that leads us to his nickname, the War Horse.
The warhorse of reform.
But every warrior has a blind spot, don't they? And his seems to have been a massive one. We have to talk about the Civil War.
We do. This is the most difficult and complex part of his legacy. It's the part where modern listeners will really struggle to empathize with him. John Chambers was a copperhead.
A copperhead. So a northerner who sympathized with the South.
Correct. And for a man living and preaching in Philadelphia, the birthplace of liberty, a major Union hub during the Civil War, that was a dangerous and incredibly controversial position to take.
I have to stop you there because my brain is short-circuiting a little. This is a guy who stood outside in a drenching rain to protest whiskey being served at a funeral because he saw it as an immoral substance that ruined families.
Yes.
He's obsessed with personal morality, but he's okay with the institution of slavery. That seems like a massive, glaring moral contradiction. How did he possibly square that circle in his own mind?
It brings us right back to that hermeneutic, that method of reading the Bible that we talked about at the very beginning, the Buckeye literalism.
How does that connect?
The abolitionists, the anti-slavery movement, were arguing for what they called the higher law. They admitted that the Constitution, as written, allowed slavery. They even admitted that parts of the Bible, like the Old Testament or Paul's letter to Philemon, seemed to regulate slavery rather than abolish it. But they argued there was a higher law of human spirit and God-given dignity that superseded the written text.
And Chambers hated that idea.
He despised it. To John Chambers, the higher law was just another version of the Catholic Creed or the Presbyterian Confession. It was man adding his own ideas, his own feelings, on top of God's revealed word.
Oh, wow. I see the connection now.
He looked at the Bible, he saw Philemon, he saw the Mosaic laws concerning slaves, and he said, God allows this. He looked at the Constitution, which he viewed as a nearly sacred document, and saw that it protected the institution of slavery. For him to argue against that was to argue against God and country.
So to him, the abolitionists were the real heretics.
Exactly. He viewed the abolitionists as dangerous fanatics who were putting their own moral feelings and their spirit of the age above the literal word of God. In his mind, the Civil War was a terrible sin because it was an armed rebellion against a constitution that he viewed as divinely appointed.
That is chillingly consistent. It's a form of legalism that completely overrides what we would see as basic humanity.
It is. But in his mind, he was being faithful. He was refusing to add to the word of God, even if the result of that refusal was horrific. He saw it as his duty.
Did he get in trouble for this? I mean, preaching pro-South sentiment in Philadelphia during the war must have been risky.
He was in serious hot water. There was a very tense moment where the trustees of his church, the lay leaders, became terrified that angry unionist mobs might burn the church down.
A real threat at the time.
A very real threat. Chambers was in the pulpit, preaching against the war, preaching against the Lincoln administration. So the trustees took matters into their own hands.
Oh, they do?
They climbed up onto the roof of the church and raised a massive Union flag over the building.
Against the pastor's wishes.
Essentially as an act of self-preservation. It was a signal to the mob, don't burn us down, we're loyal even if the guy in the pulpit is a copperhead. It shows the incredible tension of the time. You have a congregation that, for the most part, loves their pastor but is terrified of his politics.
And you have a pastor who is willing to risk his church, his reputation, and his physical safety to stand for what he believes is the biblical position, even when that position is supporting the Confederacy.
It really complicates the hero narrative, doesn't it? He's not just the simple man of God. He's a man of his time, and in this case, he was trapped in his own rigid logic.
I think it serves as a powerful warning. You can be so committed to your own idea of literalism that you miss the spirit of justice completely. You can be so busy fighting the infidels on one front that you find yourself on the wrong side of history regarding human freedom.
It's a profound challenge to any belief system.
And yet, despite being a copperhead, despite the chains, despite the heretic label, his church kept growing. The source material calls him a master of hearts. You don't build a massive loyal movement just by being a grumpy contrarian.
Yeah.
There had to be a warmer side to this war horse.
There was. And this is the great paradox of John Chambers, the ministry of the heart. Despite his fierce, almost violent public rhetoric against sin and skepticism, he was apparently incredibly tender as a pastor to his own flock.
How did that manifest?
The biography highlights his work in what was called the inquiry room.
What was the inquiry room?
After the big public sermons, if people were moved or had questions or wanted to join the faith, they would be invited to the inquiry room for a more personal conversation.
Okay.
Now, given his public persona, you'd expect him to go in there and just grill them on theology. Do you believe in a literal hell? Do you renounce the theater? Do you subscribe to my views?
Sign this form, check these boxes.
Right. But he didn't do that at all. He refused to use that space for debate or theological argument. He used it for emotional connection. He reportedly cried with people. He prayed with them. He knew everyone's name, their children's names, their struggles. He visited the sick relentlessly. When you, as an individual, were suffering, the warhorse disappeared and the shepherd appeared.
That's a fascinating split. It seems he had a huge influence on young men. Specifically, the outline mentions the 3 big W's.
Yes, 3 young men he mentored who went on to become giants in their fields. The most famous of them was John Wanamaker.
The department store king. The man who basically invented the modern retail experience.
The very same. The man who revolutionized retail in America, who built these massive commercial empires, sat under John Chambers' teaching as a young man. It's fascinating to think that Wanamaker's famous drive, his integrity in business, and his massive organizational skill were partly molded by this fierce, independent preacher.
So Chambers wasn't just creating theologians, he was building men who went out and conquered the marketplace.
And he taught them to do it, in his view, for the glory of God.
There is a specific anecdote about the biographer, Griffiths, from when he was a boy that I really liked. It's the telescope story. I feel like this humanizes Chambers more than anything else we've talked about.
It's a beautiful moment, and it shows his pastoral wisdom. Griffiths, as a young boy in the congregation, desperately wanted to go to the circus.
And the circus was definitely on the banned list, right up there with the theater.
No, absolutely. Worldly, noisy, immoral, a waste of time and money. Chambers finds out that the boy wants to go. Now, the warhorse response would be to scold him, maybe threaten him with that literal hell we talked about.
The circus is the devil's playground, son.
Exactly. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he invites the boy over to his house one evening to look through a telescope at the stars. He spends time with him, pointing out the constellations, explaining the vastness of the universe.
What was the lesson there? What was he trying to do?
He was redirecting the boy's natural desire for wonder. He was showing him that you don't need the cheap, fake, man-made spectacle of the circus. You have the genuine, overwhelming majesty of God's creation right above your head for free every night. He wasn't just saying no to the circus. He was saying, look at this bigger, better thing instead.
He turned a worldly desire into an act of worship.
He did. And it shows a wisdom in dealing with human nature that goes way beyond mere legalism or just shouting no.
That is a great image. The war horse looking at the stars. So, how does his story end? He spent nearly half a century as an independent, a rebel, an outcast. Does he die an outcast?
Surprisingly, no. And this is the final fascinating twist in his story. As Chambers got older, he began to realize the structural weakness of his own position. An independent church is fragile. It rests entirely on the personality and the charisma of the leader.
So if he dies, the movement dies with him.
Exactly. He started to worry about his legacy, not his personal fame, but the survival of the community, the flock that he had built over all those decades. He wanted them to be safe after he was gone.
So what did he do?
At the very end of his life, after 48 years of independence, he led his church back into the Presbyterian fold.
He went back to the very institution, the very people who had called him a heretic.
He did. He submitted to the presbytery. And he had this humble, almost humorous admission that he made. He said, I can swallow some things now I could not 40 years ago.
That's a huge admission from a man like him.
It's an incredible admission. It shows a mellowing, a pragmatism that came with age. The theological warrior realized that structure, unity, and institutions, even with those man-made creeds he had hated his whole life, might be necessary for the faith to survive the generations. It was a final act of humility. He sacrificed his most cherished principle, his independence, to ensure his people had a home.
So let's try to bring this all together. We have John Chambers, the Irish log cabin boy who defies the presbytery, who literally chains off the streets of Philadelphia to claim space for God, who fights the Sunday Institute skeptics with warnings of social anarchy, and who, at the very end, makes peace with the establishment to save his flock.
A complex, fiery, and deeply contradictory figure. A man who got some very big things wrong, like the Civil War, but who got the passion part of faith right. He was never lukewarm.
So what is the big takeaway for us today? When we look at this warhorse, at his methods in his life, what should we be thinking about?
Well, I think the provocative thought to leave you with is this. Chambers fought the rising atheism of his day by insisting on the absolute, uncompromising distinctiveness of the faith. He refused to compromise with the spirit of the age.
He built a wall.
He built a wall. Today, we so often see churches and religious institutions doing the opposite. They're constantly trying to adapt to the times to stay relevant. They try to be cool. They try to be intellectual in the world's terms. They try to soften the difficult edges.
They try to be liked.
Chambers did not care if he was liked. He forced the times to reckon with him. And it raises a really interesting question for today. In the ongoing battle between faith and skepticism, is it better to come down off the wall and debate the critics on their own ground, using their own language? Or, like Nehemiah in the Old Testament and like John Chambers, is it better to simply refuse to come down, to keep building your wall, to put up your chains, and to say, this is holy ground and we will not compromise it?
Do you engage the gashmiss, or do you just ignore the barking dog?
Precisely. Sometimes the strongest argument isn't a clever rebuttal. Sometimes it's just standing your ground in the rain.
That is a powerful place to leave it. Thank you for walking us through this incredible life.
My pleasure.
And thanks to everyone for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We'll see you on the next deep dive.